There were 10 of them. I only asked them once. I don't think they expected me to mean it. The first one laughed. I remember that sound. It was the last thing he did standing up. The dust settled around the first warrior as his knees hit the ground. The sound was soft, almost polite. The sound of a man kneeling, not falling. His hands went to his throat, but there was nothing there to remove. His eyes found hers, and she saw the confusion first, then the fear, then the understanding that he was already on his way down and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The other 9 did not move. She stood in the center of the road, her hands at her sides, the river stone warm against her throat. She had felt it pulse once, a low beat like a second heart. And then the warrior had folded. She had not moved. She had not spoken. She had only asked once, and they had laughed. The second warrior came at her with a blade drawn. She watched him come. She had time to note the way his weight shifted to his front foot, the way his shoulder dropped as he committed to the strike, the way the moonlight caught the edge of the steel. She stepped left, one bare foot finding the packed earth exactly where she needed it, and her hand moved in a slow arc, palm open, fingers extended. She did not touch him. The air between them thickened, and his momentum carried him past her, his feet losing the ground, his body twisting as he fell into the dust at the edge of the road. He did not get up. The third warrior hesitated. She saw it in his eyes, in the way he glanced at his companions, in the way his hand hovered over his belt but did not draw. She spoke again, the same sentence, the same request, her voice carrying through the cold night air without effort. "Step aside." The third warrior did not step aside. He stepped forward, slower than the first 2, his hands raised, his voice low and steady as he told her she did not know what she was doing, that she was on the wrong side of the river, that the king would not tolerate trespass. She listened. She waited until he finished, and then she said the same 2 words again, and this time her hand moved to the river stone, and the stone pulsed, and the warrior's mouth closed, and his hands lowered, and he stepped back. The remaining 7 spread out, circling, their boots scuffing the dust, their blades catching the moon. They were trying to surround her. They were trying to find the angle she could not see. They were trying to treat her like a threat they could measure and match and overwhelm with numbers. She had been surrounded before. She had been outnumbered before. She had been dismissed before by people who thought they understood what she was, by councils that had never seen her stand, by a system that had been designed to make people like her invisible. She had learned to wait. The fourth warrior lunged from behind. She did not see him, but she felt him. The shift in the air, the change in the pressure, the way the dust at her feet stirred a fraction of a second before his foot landed. She turned, and the river stone in her palm flared. Amber and the warrior froze mid-step, 1 foot off the ground, his blade extended, his eyes wide and white in the sudden glow. He was still breathing. She could see the rise and fall of his chest, the pulse at his throat, the way his pupils contracted as the light hit them. He was still alive. He just could not move. She held him there for 3 heartbeats, 4, 5. She watched the fear move through his face, from confusion to disbelief, to the slow, cold understanding that he was completely, utterly helpless. And then she released him, and he fell forward, catching himself on his hands, gasping, scrambling backward, his blade forgotten in the dust. The others broke. She did not chase them. She watched them run, their boots pounding the dirt, their voices calling out in the dark, their shapes disappearing into the tree line. She listened until the sound of their retreat faded into the distant hum of the forest, and then she knelt beside the first warrior, who was still on his knees, his hands no longer at his throat but at his sides, his breathing ragged. She placed her hand on his chest over his heart. She felt it beating fast and irregular, a bird trapped in a cage of bone. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She stayed there until his breathing slowed, until his eyes stopped searching for an enemy that was not coming, until he looked at her and saw not a threat, but a girl with a river stone and a quiet voice and a road ahead of her. She stood. She turned north. She walked. The moon was beginning to set, the sky paling at the edges, the trees casting long shadows across the road. She walked without hurry, her bare feet silent on the packed earth, the river stone at her throat still warm, the memory of the amber pulse still fading in the air behind her. She had asked once, she had meant it, and now the road stretched ahead, empty and waiting. and she followed it because there was nothing else to do. Because the thing she was looking for was north, because the promise her grandmother had made was north, because the line that had been broken and buried and forgotten was north, and she was the one who had to find it. The road narrowed, the trees thickened, the air grew colder, and she pulled the worn grey tunic tighter around her shoulders, the faded red sash at her waist catching the first light of dawn. She had been walking for 3 days. She had crossed the river on the second night, when the moon was hidden and the guards were looking south, when she had stepped into the water and felt it rise to her knees, her waist, her chest, cold and dark and alive with a current that pulled at her legs and whispered in a language she did not speak. She had crossed anyway. She had hauled the river stone above the water and felt it pulse once, twice, 3 times, a beacon in the dark, a signal that the line was not broken, that someone was coming home. And now she was here on the north side, in the territory that the old records called the Omega Line, the land that had been sealed and forgotten, the land that her grandmother had tried to claim and been denied. She walked until the road met a narrow bridge over a dark river, and there she stopped, because someone was waiting. She walked until the road met a narrow bridge over a dark river, and there she stopped, because someone was waiting. The figure stood at the center of the bridge, leaning on a wooden staff worn smooth by decades of use. An older woman, grey-haired, her face half in shadow, her posture straight despite the weight she carried. She did not move as the girl approached. She only watched, her eyes pale in the dim light, the same color as the river stone at the girl's throat. The girl stopped at the edge of the bridge, her bare feet on the first plank, the wood cold and damp. She did not speak first. She had learned to wait. The older woman spoke, her voice low, carrying across the water. "You crossed the river last night. They felt it." The girl said nothing. "The council is meeting," the older woman continued. "The king will know by morning. He will not ignore this." The girl's hand went to the river stone, her fingers tracing its smooth surface. "I did not cross to fight?" The older woman tilted her head, studying her. "Then why?" "I am looking for something. A place that was promised to my bloodline, sealed by this stone." The girl held it up, and the faint light from the river caught its surface, a deep grey, almost black, with a single line of silver running through its center. The older woman's eyes widened, just slightly, the first crack in her composure. The Omega Line. Yes, that line was broken, extinct. The council ruled it so 40 years ago. The council was wrong. The girl's voice did not rise. It did not need to. My grandmother filed the claim. She followed every protocol. She brought witnesses, records, the seal itself. They denied her. They said the line was broken because they wanted it to be. The older woman was silent for a long moment. The river moved beneath the bridge, dark and slow, carrying the sound of distant water. Then she stepped aside. "I cannot stop you," she said, "and I will not try. But the king will come. He will bring riders. He will not listen to words." The girl walked past her onto the bridge, the planks creaking under her weight. As she passed, the older woman spoke again, her voice softer now. "The forest knows you. It felt you cross. It remembers the old marks." The girl paused, half turning. "There is a shelter north of here," the older woman said, "half-collapsed stone. Rest there. The riders will need time to assemble. You have until dawn." The girl nodded once, then continued across the bridge, her bare feet silent on the wood. Behind her, the older woman remained still, her staff planted in the earth, a sentinel at the crossing. The landscape changed as she walked north. The road narrowed, the trees growing older, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches interlaced above her like the ribs of a great beast. The air grew colder, carrying the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. The sky was pale, the moon setting, the first grey light of dawn beginning to seep through the canopy. She found the shelter just as the light began to break. A small structure of grey stone, half its roof collapsed, the walls covered in moss and lichen. She stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. The floor was packed earth, dry, scattered with leaves. A small fire pit sat in the center, cold, the ash old and undisturbed. She sat against the wall, her back to the stone, her legs crossed, the river stone warm against her throat. She closed her eyes. She had not slept in 2 days. She had walked through the night, crossed the river, faced 10 warriors, and she had not stopped. But now, in the silence of the shelter, with the dawn light filtering through the broken roof, she let herself rest. The stone pulsed against her skin, a slow, steady rhythm like a heartbeat. She breathed with it, her shoulders relaxing, her mind quieting. She did not know how long she sat there, minutes, hours. Time moved differently in this place, the old forest holding its own measure. Then she heard them, distant drums faint from the south, the sound of riders assembling, the sound of pursuit. She opened her eyes. The light through the roof had shifted, the sun higher now, the shadows shorter. She had slept longer than she intended. She stood, her muscles stiff, her joints aching, but she did not hesitate. She stepped out of the shelter into the cold air and looked south. The dust cloud was visible on the horizon, small, rising above the trees. The king's riders, coming fast. She turned north and she walked. The forest opened before her, the path widening, the trees parting as if they recognized her, as if they had been waiting for this moment for generations. She did not look back. She did not slow. The river stone was cold in her palm now, the warmth of her sleep fading, replaced by the steady chill of the morning air. She held it tight, feeling its weight, its promise. She reached the edge of the forest as the sun crested the horizon, the light flooding across the open ground ahead. A wide plain of tall grass and scattered stones, and beyond it, a range of low hills, grey and bare. She stopped at the tree line, the river stone cold in her palm, and watched the dust cloud grow on the horizon. She had asked once, she would not ask again. The council chamber fell silent as the Alpha King stood. He did not look at the warriors. He looked at the map, at the empty stretch of territory north of the river, and he said one word, ride. The word carried through the stone hall like a stone dropped into still water. The councillors did not speak. The scribe stopped writing. The page by the pillar forgot to breathe. The king's hand rested on the map, his palm flat against the parchment, and he did not look up again until the first horse was saddled. 12 riders. He chose them himself. His best trackers, men who could follow a deer through a blizzard and read the age of a footprint from 3 paces. His fastest horses, the grey mares from the eastern plains that could run from dusk to dawn without breaking stride. And himself at the front, the wolf crest ring heavy on his finger, his blade sharpened, before the council had finished speaking. They rode out as the sun began to set. The gate opened, the bridge groaned under the weight of hooves, and the road north stretched before them, pale in the fading light. The king did not speak. He had nothing to say that the pace of his horse could not communicate. The first hour passed in silence. The second hour brought the river, dark and slow, and the bridge where the older woman had stood. She was gone now, but her staff remained, planted in the earth at the far end, upright and still, a warning driven into the ground like a declaration. The king reined in his horse and studied it. The wood was old, grey with age, the top carved into the shape of a circle with a line through it. The same mark, the same seal. He ordered 2 riders to remain at the bridge, then he crossed, and the rest followed. The stone shelter came into view as the moon rose. The king dismounted before his horse had stopped moving, his boots hitting the earth hard, his hand already on the hilt of his sword. The shelter was empty. The ash in the fire pit was cold, but the pattern of it told him what he needed to know. A single fire, built small, kept low, extinguished before dawn. The footprint leading north was clear in the soft earth, barefoot, small, the weight evenly distributed, the stride unhurried. He knelt beside it, one hand resting on the ground, and for a long moment he did not move. "Your Majesty." The tracker's voice was low, careful. The king looked up. The tracker was standing at the edge of the shelter, his face pale in the moonlight, one hand pointing at a tree beyond the clearing. The mark was carved into the bark at eye level, deep, old, the edges smoothed by years of wind and rain, but the shape was unmistakable, a circle, a line through it, the same symbol that had been on the staff, on the map in the old records, on the seal that his grandfather had shown him once in a locked chest, with a voice that had trembled when he spoke the name. The king stood slowly. He walked to the tree and placed his palm against the mark. The bark was cold. The carving was deep enough that his fingers could trace the full shape without touching the edges. He had seen this symbol before, in the old stories, in the records that no one read anymore, in the maps that showed the territory north of the river as empty because the council had decided it was empty, not because anyone had ever verified it. "Your Majesty," the tracker's voice again, quieter now, "the mark is older than the tree." The king turned. The tracker was holding a small piece of bark that had fallen from the trunk. The inner surface was smooth, the grain uninterrupted. The mark had been carved when the tree was young, and the tree had grown around it, incorporating it into its own structure. This was not a recent claim. This was a claim that had been made generations ago, and the forest had accepted it. The king looked at the mark again. Then he looked north, into the dark line of trees that stretched beyond the shelter, beyond the clearing, beyond everything his map showed. "Move faster," he said. But his voice was quieter now, less certain. They rode through the night. The moon tracked across the sky, and the horses moved in a steady rhythm, hooves muffled by the earth, breath misting in the cold air. The land changed as they went north. The grass grew thinner, the trees grew older. The air carried a smell that the king could not name, something between old stone and deep water, something that did not belong to this world. The trackers found signs of her passage, a broken twig, a footprint in a patch of soft ground, the faint impression of a hand on a moss-covered rock. The fingers spread wide, the pressure even. She was not hiding, she was not running, she was walking north, and she was not in a hurry. The king's hand tightened on the reins. They reached the edge of the forest as the first light of dawn touched the sky. The trees rose before them, tall and dark, their branches interwoven so densely that the ground beneath was in permanent shadow. The path that led into the forest was narrow, barely wide enough for a single rider, and the air that came out of it was cold and still. The king dismounted. The trackers dismounted behind him. The horses shifted, uneasy, their ears flicking back and forth, their nostrils flaring at something the riders could not smell. "Wait here," the king said. He walked into the forest alone. The path twisted and turned, the trees pressing in from both sides, the light dimming with every step. The silence was absolute, no birds, no wind, no sound of his own footsteps, because the ground was soft with decades of fallen leaves, and the earth swallowed every sound. He walked for 10 minutes, 20. The path forked, and he chose the left branch, then the right, then another left, and he was not sure if he was going north anymore. The trees all looked the same. The light did not change, the silence did not break. Then he heard a sound, a single note, low and clear, like a bell struck far away, the vibration carrying through the earth and into his bones. It came from ahead, from somewhere deeper in the forest, and when he looked down, he saw that the path at his feet was glowing, faint, amber, the same color as the river stone. He followed it. The path opened into a clearing, and the girl was there. She was sitting on a fallen log, her hands resting on her knees, the river stone glowing faintly in her palm. Her eyes were closed, her breathing was slow and even. She did not open her eyes when he entered the clearing, but she spoke. "You have come far." Her voice was quiet, not tired, not afraid, simply quiet, the way a person speaks when they have been expecting you and they are not surprised that you arrived. The king stopped at the edge of the clearing. His hand went to his sword, but he did not draw. The girl opened her eyes and looked at him. "I will give you the same choice I gave them," she said. "Step aside." The king stood still. The river stone pulsed once, and the ground beneath his feet trembled. The trees around the clearing began to move slowly, deliberately, their branches bending away from the girl, their roots shifting in the earth, opening a path north that had not been there a moment before. The king looked at the path. Then he looked at the girl. Her hand was open, the river stone resting in her palm, and for the first time he noticed that the stone was not a stone. It was a seal. The edges were carved with symbols he could not read, and the light that came from it was not firelight or sunlight or any light he had ever seen. "Who are you?" he asked. The girl stood. She was small, barefoot. Her tunic was worn, her sash faded, her hair pulled back. She looked like nothing. She looked like everything. "I am the last of the Omega line," she said. "I am the one your ancestors buried. I am the claim that was denied, and I am going home." The king's sword hand fell to his side. He did not draw. He could not. The girl turned and walked into the opening. The trees closed behind her, and the path vanished, and the clearing was empty. The king stood alone at the edge of the clearing, his sword lowered, his breath visible in the cold air. He had come to stop her. He had come to understand. He had come with 12 riders and a blade and the weight of a kingdom behind him. None of it had mattered. He walked back through the forest, and the path was straight and the trees did not move, and he found his riders waiting at the edge, their faces pale, their horses restless. He mounted without speaking. He turned south. He did not look back. The king returned to his council alone, the river stone in his hand, and gave one order. The territory north of the river was closed. No one would follow her. No one would ask where she had gone. And the old stories, the ones he had dismissed as myth, were read aloud in the great hall for the first time in 3 generations. The girl stood at the edge of the forest, the river stone cold in her palm, and watched the dust cloud grow on the horizon. She had asked once. She would not ask again. The forest was not a place of refuge. It was a place of waiting. The trees here were old, older than the kingdom, older than the stories the Alpha King's grandfather had told. Their trunks were thick as houses, their branches woven together so tightly that the morning light came through in threads, not beams. The air smelled of damp earth and something sharp, something metallic, like the scent of water over stone. She stepped forward, and the forest received her. The first tree she passed had a mark carved into its bark, a circle with a line through it, the same symbol she had seen on the tree at the edge of the road, the same symbol that had made the king's trackers pause. She touched it with her free hand, and the bark was warm as if the tree had been holding sunlight long after the sun had set. Behind her she heard the horses, not close yet, but close enough. The king's riders had reached the tree line. She did not look back. The forest shifted around her. She did not will it. It simply happened. The path she walked was straight, but the path behind her was not. Branches that had been at shoulder height when she passed were now at head height, their leaves dense, their thorns sharp. Roots that had been flat against the earth now rose in ridges, tripping hooves, slowing riders. The forest was older than the kingdom, and it remembered things the kingdom had forgotten. She walked until she could no longer hear the horses. Then she walked until she could no longer hear anything at all. The silence in the deep forest was not empty. It was full, full of the sound of things growing, things decaying, things waiting. She stopped once to drink from a stream that ran black over dark stones, and she saw her reflection in the water. The river stone glowed faintly beneath her chin, casting a pale amber light across her face. She looked tired. She looked young. She looked like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. She kept walking. The king's riders entered the forest with confidence. They were trackers, hunters, men who had followed game through every terrain the kingdom had to offer. They knew the land. They had been born on it, buried their fathers in it, raised their children on its stories. They did not fear the forest, but the forest did not recognize them. The first rider to lose his way was a man named Iran, the king's best tracker, a man who could read the shape of a footprint in dry stone. He followed the girl's trail into a grove of silver-bark trees, and when he looked up, the trail was gone. The ground was undisturbed, the trees were identical in every direction. He turned his horse in a full circle, and the grove looked the same from every angle. He called out. No one answered. The second rider, a young man named Torin, found himself on a path that curved back on itself 3 times before he realized he was walking in a loop. He dismounted, tried to lead his horse through the underbrush, and found the branches so dense that he could not push through. He heard the king's voice somewhere ahead, but when he answered, his voice came back to him from all directions, as if the forest was echoing him, mocking him. The third rider, the oldest, a man named Varric, who had served the king's father before him, stopped his horse at the base of a massive oak and looked up at the mark carved into its trunk. A circle with a line through it. He had seen this mark before. He had been told never to speak of it. He did not speak of it. He turned his horse and began the slow, careful work of finding his way back to the edge of the forest. The king did not lose his way, because he did not allow himself to. He was a man who had been raised to believe that the world yielded to those who did not yield to it. He dismounted when his horse refused to go further. He drew his sword when the shadows grew too deep to see. He walked forward, one step at a time, his boots sinking into the soft earth, his breath visible in the cold air. He found himself in a clearing. The girl was there, sitting on a fallen log, the river stone glowing faintly in her palm. She did not look surprised to see him. She looked like she had been waiting. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, his sword lowered but not sheathed. The forest around him was still. The birds had stopped singing. The wind had stopped moving. The only sound was his own breathing and the slow, steady rhythm of his heart. "You have come far," she said. He did not answer. He was studying her, the way she sat, the way she held the stone, the way her eyes met his without fear, without defiance, without anything he could name. "I will give you the same choice I gave them," she said. "Step aside." The king's grip tightened on his sword. "You crossed the river," he said. "You attacked my warriors. You entered my territory without permission, and you tell me to step aside." "Yes." "Why?" She stood, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. The river stone in her palm flared once, a pulse of amber light that cast long shadows across the clearing. "Because this territory was never yours, she said. "It was promised to my bloodline before your kingdom existed. The river stone is the seal. The forest remembers. The council denied the claim, but the claim was never theirs to deny." The king stared at her. He wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her that the kingdom had held this land for 300 years, that the records were clear, that the council had ruled, that the law was the law. But he had seen the mark on the tree. He had heard the old stories from his grandfather, stories about a line of people who could speak to the land, who could make the trees move and the rivers turn, who had held a territory that stretched from the mountains to the sea, and had given it up not in battle but in trust, a promise that it would be returned when the time was right. He had never believed those stories. He had thought they were myths, fables, the kind of tales you told children to make them behave. The girl held out the river stone. It pulsed once, and the ground beneath them trembled. The roots of the forest shifted, the trees bending away from the clearing, revealing a path north that had not been there before. The path was straight, wide, lined with trees that had grown in a perfect arc, their branches arching overhead like the roof of a cathedral. The king looked at the path. He looked at the girl. He looked at his sword still in his hand, and he realized that he had not raised it, had not even thought about raising it since the moment he had entered the clearing. He sheathed his sword. The girl walked past him, her bare feet silent on the earth. She did not look back. She did not need to. The forest closed behind her, the trees settling back into place, the path disappearing as if it had never been. The king stood alone at the edge of the clearing, his sword lowered, his breath visible in the cold air. "Who are you?" he asked. The girl's voice came from somewhere ahead through the trees, quiet but clear, carrying the weight of everything that had been buried and was now being unearthed. "I am the last of the Omega line, and I have come to claim what was promised." The king did not follow. He did not try. He stood in the clearing until the light began to change, until the shadows grew long and the air grew cold, and then he turned and began the walk back to his horse, back to his riders, back to the kingdom that had believed it was the only power in the land. He returned to his council alone, the river stone in his hand. He gave one order. The territory north of the river was closed. No one would follow her. No one would ask where she had gone, and the old stories, the ones he had dismissed as myth, were read aloud in the great hall for the first time in 3 generations. The king stood alone at the edge of the clearing, his sword lowered, his breath visible in the cold air. "Who are you?" he asked. The girl did not answer immediately. She stood with her back to him, facing the path that had opened through the forest, the river stone glowing faintly in her palm. The trees had bent away from her like supplicants, their branches still trembling, roots still settling into the disturbed earth. She turned her head slightly, enough for him to see the profile of her face, the line of her jaw, the dark eye that caught the pale morning light. "My name is Hannah," she said, "daughter of Sujin, granddaughter of Yunhee, last of the Omega line." The king's hand dropped from his sword. He had heard that name in stories, in the old records kept in the sealed archives beneath the council hall, in the whispered warnings his grandfather had given him when he was a boy sitting at the old man's knee. The Omega line was not supposed to exist. It had been declared extinct 3 generations ago, its claims voided, its territories absorbed, its name erased from every official document and public record. The council had voted on it, the scribes had recorded it. The king's own grandfather had signed the decree, and yet here she stood, barefoot on the cold forest floor, the river stone pulsing with a light that should not exist in this age. "I do not understand," the king said, and his voice was quiet now, stripped of the authority he had carried across the bridge and through the forest. "The line was broken, the records are clear. Your grandmother's claim was denied, and she was given passage north, and she never returned. That was 40 years ago." "Yes," Hannah said, "she never returned, but she did not die." She turned fully to face him, and the king saw something in her expression that he had not seen in any of the warriors who had fought beside him, any of the counselors who had advised him, any of the enemies who had stood against him in battle. It was not anger, it was not triumph. It was the patience of someone who had been waiting for a very long time and whose wait was finally ending. "She crossed the river," Hannah continued, "and she walked north, and she found what she was looking for, the place that was promised, the place that the council denied existed. She lived there for 37 years, and she taught me everything she knew. And when she died, she gave me the stone, and she told me to come back." The king shook his head. "The territory north of the river is empty. Our scouts have mapped it for 3 generations. There is nothing there but old forest and older ruins, and the ruins are empty." "The ruins are not empty," Hannah said. "They are sealed, and the seal has been waiting for someone who carries the stone." She held up the river stone, and the king saw it clearly for the first time, a small polished oval of grey-green stone, worn smooth by generations of hands, suspended on a leather cord that had been replaced many times. There were markings on its surface, faint lines that caught the light, and, as he watched, the lines shifted, rearranged themselves into a pattern he recognized. The mark on the tree, the seal of the Omega line, the symbol that had been carved into the lintel of the old council chamber before it was torn down and replaced with the new one. "The council denied my grandmother's claim because she could not produce the stone," Hannah said. "They said it was lost, that the line had broken, that the territory was forfeit. But the stone was not lost. It was hidden by my great-grandmother, who saw what the council was planning and knew that the only way to preserve the claim was to make it invisible. She gave the stone to her daughter, and her daughter gave it to me, and I have carried it across the river and through the forest, and I have come to the place where the seal waits." She turned and faced the path again, the trees still holding their positions, the air still and cold. The path stretched north, narrow and winding, disappearing into the grey light of the forest. There was something at the end of it, something the king could not see but could feel, a weight in the air, a pressure against his chest, a silence that was deeper than the silence of the forest around them. "You cannot go further," the king said, and his voice was the voice of a man who knew he was about to be proven wrong, but had to say the words anyway. "This territory belongs to the crown. The claim was denied. The records are closed." Hannah looked at him, and her expression did not change. The records were closed because the council was afraid. They knew the Omega line was real. They knew the territory was promised. They knew that if the claim was honored, they would lose control of the north, and they did not want to lose control of anything, so they declared the line extinct, and they sealed the records, and they told everyone that the territory was empty. She stepped forward, her bare foot landing on the first stretch of the path, and the ground beneath her seemed to accept her weight, the soil settling, the roots drawing back. The river stone glowed brighter, and the king felt something shift in the air around him, a pressure releasing, a door opening. "My grandmother filed the claim 40 years ago," Hannah said, still walking, her voice carrying back to him over her shoulder. "She followed every procedure. She submitted every document. She attended every session. And the council denied her, not because the claim was invalid, but because they had already decided that it would be denied. They had already decided that the Omega line was extinct, and they were not going to let a woman with a piece of paper change their minds." She stopped, and the king saw her hand go to the river stone, her fingers closing around it, her shoulders straightening. "They were wrong," she said, "and I have come to prove it." She walked forward, and the forest closed behind her, the trees shifting back into their original positions, the path disappearing, the air settling. The king stood alone in the clearing, his sword still at his side, his breath visible in the cold air. the silence pressing in around him. He stood there for a long time, long enough for the sun to climb above the trees, long enough for the cold to seep into his bones, long enough for the riders he had left behind to find their way to the clearing. Their horses lathered, their faces pale with fear and confusion. "Your Majesty," one of them said, dismounting and approaching, his voice uncertain. "The forest. We could not find the path. The trees, they shifted. We heard—" "I know," the king said. He did not turn. He was still looking at the place where the path had been, at the wall of trees that stood where Hannah had walked, at the emptiness that had replaced her presence. "Your Majesty," the rider said again, "what do we do?" The king did not answer for a long moment. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch, old and worn, that he had carried since his grandfather's death. He opened it, and inside was a piece of parchment yellowed with age folded into a square. He unfolded it, and the rider saw that it was a map, an old map hand-drawn, showing territories that no longer existed, borders that had been redrawn, names that had been forgotten. There was a symbol in the corner of the map, the same symbol that was carved into the tree, the same symbol that was on the river stone, the same symbol that his grandfather had shown him once when he was a boy, and had told him to remember, because one day it would matter. "Your Majesty," the rider said again, and this time his voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "What is that?" The king folded the map and put it back into the pouch. He turned to face the rider, and the rider saw something in his expression that he had never seen before. Not fear, not uncertainty, but recognition. The recognition of something that had been waiting, that had always been waiting, that had been hidden and forgotten and dismissed, but that had never stopped existing. "We ride back to the council," the king said, "and we open the archives, all of them." The rider stared at him. "Your Majesty, the sealed archives, the council has not opened them in 40 years, Grandmother King said. "I know." He mounted his horse, and the riders followed, and they rode south, away from the forest, away from the path that had closed, away from the girl who had walked into the north and taken the truth of the Omega line with her. The council chamber was silent when the king returned. The councillors were waiting, their faces drawn, their hands clasped in front of them. They had heard the rumors. They had seen the riders return without the girl. They had felt the shift in the air, the pressure that had released, the door that had opened. The king walked to the head of the table, and he did not sit. He stood and he looked at each of them in turn, and they saw the same recognition in his eyes that the rider had seen in the clearing. 40 years ago, the king said, this council denied a claim. The claim was valid. The documents were in order. The line was not broken, and we denied it anyway, because we were afraid of what it would mean if we honored it. The councillors shifted, their eyes dropping, their hands tightening. The Omega line was not extinct, the king continued. It was hidden, the stone was preserved, the territory was sealed, and now the heir has returned, and she has walked into the north, and she has opened the seal. He reached into his coat and pulled out the leather pouch, and he held it up so that every councillor could see it. This map was given to me by my grandfather, he said. He told me to keep it because one day someone would come who would need it. I did not understand what he meant. I thought it was a story, a legend, a piece of history that no longer mattered. He paused, and the silence in the chamber was absolute. I was wrong. He opened the pouch and pulled out the map, and he laid it on the table, spreading it open so that the councillors could see the territories that no longer existed, the borders that had been redrawn, the names that had been forgotten. And at the center of the map, in the empty stretch of territory north of the river, there was a single mark, a circle with a line through it. The seal of the Omega line? The councillors stared at the map, and the king watched them, and he saw the recognition spreading across their faces, the same recognition that had spread across his own face in the clearing. The recognition of something that had been waiting, that had always been waiting, that had been hidden and forgotten and dismissed, but that had never stopped existing. The territory north of the river is closed, the king said. No one will follow her. No one will ask where she has gone. The archives will be opened and the records will be restored, and the Omega line will be recognized. A councillor stood, his face pale, his voice